That day, Peppa and her little sister Ivy were playing happily in their room. Peppa was building a tall tower with blocks, while Ivy, always a curious little one, was exploring every corner of the room. Suddenly, Ivy noticed something under Peppa's bed. She crawled over and pulled out a strange yellow toy with huge black eyes and sharp, realistic-looking teeth. The little one clapped her hands joyfully, hugging the find close to herself. Peppa was surprised. She had never seen this toy before. On the tag was written a strange name, Laboo. "Ivy, where did you get this toy? I've never seen it before," said Peppa, examining the strange creature. "What a weird name. And its teeth look so real." Despite the uneasy feeling, Peppa let Ivy play with the new toy. And then, something incredible happened. A second window appeared in the room, one that had never been there before. Behind this dark window stretched a gloomy forest with trees resembling the silhouettes of Laboo toys. "What is this? Where did this window come from?" exclaimed Peppa in shock. But Ivy seemed completely oblivious to the new window. She was entirely absorbed in playing with Laboo. Little Ivy pressed the toy to her ear, as if listening to something very important. She smiled and nodded her head, as if agreeing with something. "Ivy, who are you talking to?" asked the worried Peppa. But the little one just continued hugging the toy and smiling. When their mother entered the room, Peppa tried to tell her about the strange window and toy. "Mummy, look! A second window appeared in our room, and Ivy is talking to this strange toy," Peppa said excitedly, but their mother couldn't see anything. For her, there was only an ordinary wall, and Ivy was simply playing by herself. "You have quite an imagination, Peppa," said their mother, and left, unaware of the approaching danger. "But Mummy, it's right here!" cried Peppa, but it was useless. As night fell, events took an even more sinister turn. Peppa couldn't sleep, watching the dark window. Meanwhile, Ivy, hugging Laboo, began humming a strange, mesmerizing melody. The little one couldn't speak yet, but she hummed this tune as if she had known it her whole life. "Laboo, Laboo." "Ivy, what are you singing? How do you know this song?" asked Peppa fearfully, but Ivy just continued humming and rocking with the toy. Peppa looked at the second window and was horrified. Behind the glass, dozens of pairs of eyes were glowing. An entire army of Laboo toys was watching them from the dark forest. The next night, the most terrible thing happened. Peppa woke up to an unusual silence. Ivy's crib was empty. The Laboo toy had also disappeared. The second window was wide open, and in the forest, Peppa saw the retreating silhouette of her little sister. Ivy was walking, holding hands with a large figure that looked like Laboo. "Ivy, come back!" screamed Peppa, but it was too late. Ivy disappeared into the depths of the dark forest, and the window behind her closed and dissolved into the wall as if it had never existed. In the morning, their parents searched the entire house, the entire neighborhood, but Ivy was nowhere to be found. Mummy cried, Daddy called the police, and Peppa remained silent. She knew the truth, but who would believe her? A whole year passed. Peppa learned to live with this terrible secret. She played alone in her room, which now seemed too big and empty without Ivy's laughter. And then one day, while cleaning under her bed, Peppa found a small teddy bear. It was so cute and harmless. "What a lovely bear," smiled Peppa, picking it up. But as soon as she lifted the teddy bear, that same dark window appeared in the room again. Behind the glass stood Ivy. But this was no longer the cheerful little one that Peppa remembered. Ivy's skin had turned yellow, and her eyes were black, just like Laboo's. In her hands, she held that same cursed toy and slowly waved her hand. Although Ivy couldn't speak, Peppa seemed to hear her voice in her head. "Join us, big sister." Peppa dropped the teddy bear in horror. She realized that the nightmare was just beginning, and now Laboo had come for her. Late at night, Peppa and George were still awake. They sat on the floor of their bedroom, building a tower out of blocks and laughing. Outside stretched the darkness, the wind rustling through the branches of the trees. But suddenly the room grew colder. At first, just a faint draft, then an icy current of air that made the toys on the shelves begin to sway. "Peppa, I'm scared," George whispered. The toys began to move. Cars rolled across the floor on their own. The teddy bear lifted its paw, and a doll tilted its head so sharply that its neck cracked. Peppa pulled her brother close and felt the walls begin to change. The drawings on the wallpaper came alive. Flowers stretched into black, writhing lines like shadows, creeping slowly upward. The bedroom door creaked and swung open. A silhouette appeared on the threshold. It looked like Daddy Pig, but twisted, like a reflection in a warped mirror. His body was covered with green growths, like avocados, and his arms were massive and powerful, like those of a gorilla. His eyes glowed a dim red. This was the avocado gorilla. He leaned forward and spoke in a deep voice. "Let's play a game. Stay absolutely still until morning. Any movement, and you lose." Peppa and George froze where they were. In the corridor behind him appeared the figures of Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig. But they were not their parents. Their faces were lifeless, their smiles too wide, and their eyes were empty, black voids. They stood motionless, staring directly at the children. The house began to distort. The ceiling rose higher, the walls stretched, and new doors appeared. Doors that had never been there before. One opened on its own, revealing only fog and the sound of heavy footsteps. The air grew thick and cold, and the lamp overhead flickered as if it were breathing in rhythm with Peppa's heart. "I can see you," the avocado gorilla said, his voice echoing as if from inside the house itself. "Whether you stand still, whether you breathe too loudly, I will notice." George gripped his sister's hand so tightly, Peppa's fingers turned white. She didn't dare move. It seemed the shadows on the walls were watching them, waiting to catch even the slightest twitch. Minutes dragged on endlessly. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind sounded like thunder. Time itself felt frozen. Peppa knew that if she flinched even once, the game would end, and the end would be terrible. When the clock hands finally crept past dawn, the figures began to fade. The avocado gorilla slowly dissolved like smoke. The shadows sank back into the walls, and the drawings on the wallpaper turned ordinary again. The room returned to normal, but Peppa and George knew it hadn't been a dream. It was a test. The next morning, their parents acted as if nothing had happened. Mummy made breakfast. Daddy read his paper. Peppa wanted to ask about the night, but stayed silent. They remembered nothing. Or maybe they simply didn't want to. A day later, the family went to Grandpa Pig's farm. Peppa was excited about the trip, but unease gnawed at her. From the very moment they approached, she noticed everything was different. The trees seemed taller than before, their branches weaving into a heavy canopy. The ground was soft, almost damp, and every step released the smell of rot. The farm was silent. The usual chatter of animals was gone. The barn was empty. The shed stood open, but inside there wasn't a sound. Even the ducks on the pond sat motionless, like statues. Grandpa Pig greeted them with a smile, but his eyes were strange. In them glowed the same red light Peppa had seen in the avocado gorilla. "Welcome," he said. "Today we'll play a game too." The family stood in the middle of the yard, surrounded by fog. The houses and trees around the farm seemed to blend together into one vast living creature. Peppa felt the ground beneath her feet tremble, and in that trembling she heard the familiar breathing of the avocado gorilla. She squeezed George's hand and realized the game was not over. Their home, their farm, their world, it had already changed. The avocado gorilla was watching them, and now he was everywhere. It all began with something small. Peppa woke up in her room and saw the sun shining through the window just like always. George was asleep beside her, lying on his side, hugging his dinosaur. Everything seemed ordinary. From downstairs came the familiar sounds. Mummy Pig making breakfast, Daddy Pig rustling his newspaper. Peppa went down, and on the table a bowl of porridge was waiting for her. But the porridge was cold. She tasted it. It had no flavor at all, no sweetness, no salt, just emptiness. Peppa frowned but said nothing. The day passed as usual. A walk in the garden, lunch, games with George, a bedtime story, and then sleep again. The next morning, everything repeated. George lay in the same position. Mummy cooked the same breakfast. Daddy held the newspaper in the same way. And again, the porridge was cold. Peppa thought it was déjà vu, but by the third day, it was clear. This was no coincidence. George said the same word, dinosaur. Her parents repeated the same phrases. The sun fell at the same angle, and everything followed the same script. On the fourth day, Peppa decided to test it. She didn't go down for breakfast, staying in her room instead. But nothing changed. Downstairs, the same voices continued. George said the same things. Her parents didn't notice her absence, as if it had already been written that way. "Mummy," Peppa asked cautiously, "what day is it today?" Mummy Pig looked at her and smiled, too wide. "Today is today." The words sounded hollow, like an echo. Time lost all meaning. Day after day, nothing changed. Only Peppa felt the growing unease. The walls began to seem alive. The windows glowed with a flat white light, as though they weren't showing the outside world at all, but painted scenery. Doors led to the same rooms, but at wrong angles, as if the house was folding and unfolding on itself. On the seventh day, Peppa woke up earlier than everyone else, or so it seemed. The room was dark, though the clock said it was morning. George lay beside her, his eyes wide open. He didn't blink, he didn't breathe. But when Peppa called his name, he suddenly sat up, smiled too quickly, too perfectly, and said, "Today will be a good day, Peppa." And then he froze again. Fear gripped her. She hid under the blanket, but deep down she knew this wasn't her home anymore. Soon Daddy Pig vanished. His place at the table was empty, though the newspaper still lay on the chair. Then Mummy disappeared. Then George. No one noticed their absence. It was as if they had never existed. Only Peppa remembered. On the final day, she gathered her courage and stepped outside. What met her wasn't the world. The grass was painted flat on the ground. The trees were cardboard cutouts. The sky was nothing but a dull grey light, without sun or clouds. It all looked like a stage set. And then she heard it. A monotonous, distorted melody, like something played on a broken record. From around the corner of the house came Tralalelo Tralala. His movements were jerky, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. His red eyes glowed in the half-light. His mouth opened and closed, and each time that same strange tune spilled out. Tralalelo, tralala. The sound echoed through the empty world, bouncing off the walls of her mind. Peppa tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. It was as if her feet were fused to the ground. Her thoughts grew heavy, blurred. The world around her shook, its lines smeared like wet paint. Then, among the cardboard trees, a figure appeared. Dancing, laughter pierced the grey sky, louder, sharper. It was Lirili Larilla. Her movements were graceful, spinning as if she was enjoying the nightmare. Her form broke apart into fragments, then reassembled, as if she didn't belong to this world at all. Peppa stood alone. The house behind her no longer looked like a home, but like another piece of scenery. The creatures closed in. Tralalelo Tralala stepped closer, his glowing red eyes burning brighter. Lirili Larilla's laughter rose, her silhouette trembling, about to reach out for Peppa herself. And at that moment, Peppa understood. This wasn't a dream, not déjà vu, not repetition. It was a game, their game, and she was next. An ordinary day in Peppa Pig's house passed quietly and almost unnoticed. But Peppa herself immediately noticed. Her little brother George was different. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't running around the house like he usually did. Even his favorite dinosaur lay forgotten in the corner, unwanted. George sat by the window, staring into the grey sky, silent. His eyes seemed empty, as if he wasn't looking at anything at all but falling into a bottomless void. "George?" Peppa asked carefully. "Are you all right?" But he didn't answer. He only slowly turned his head to his sister and gave her a faint smile. That smile wasn't warm. It had no joy, no trace of his usual childish innocence. A chill ran down Peppa's spine. At dinner that evening, he barely ate. Their parents tried to talk, but George replied only in single words, or not at all. Peppa noticed that Mummy and Daddy seemed not to see anything strange. They behaved as if George had always been this quiet and distant. Days passed. Each time Peppa found her brother, he was in a different place, out in the garden, by the window, in the hallway, and every time he just sat there, unmoving, as if waiting for something. His eyes grew emptier with each passing day. Peppa tried to play with him, but he never reacted. Sometimes she caught his stare, long, unblinking, foreign. And then, one evening, Peppa noticed George quietly rise and walk to the door. His steps were slow and steady, as though he knew exactly where he was going. "George, wait!" Peppa called, but he didn't turn back. She ran after him. Outside, drizzle filled the air, cold and heavy. George walked straight toward the forest behind their house. Peppa's heart pounded in her chest faster and faster, but she couldn't stop herself. Curiosity and fear pushed her forward. Deep in the woods stood an old hut. Peppa had never seen it before, even though she'd played in these woods many times. The door hung half open and cold air seeped out. George stepped inside, and after a brief hesitation, Peppa followed him. Inside, it was dark, smelling of dust and mold. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet. George stood in the center of the room. Slowly, he turned toward her. His eyes were utterly lifeless, like two bottomless pits. A wide, unnatural smile was frozen on his face. "I'm not George anymore," he whispered. His voice was low, hollow, as if it belonged to someone else. Peppa's knees went weak. She stumbled backward, but George melted into the darkness, vanishing as if he had never been there. The room filled with silence, so heavy that her ears rang. Terrified, Peppa ran out of the hut, tripping and stumbling until she reached home. She burst into the hallway, gasping for air, her heart hammering. But when she looked into George's room, she froze. He was there, sitting on the floor, playing with his blocks, as if nothing had happened. He was even humming a soft tune. "George," Peppa whispered. He lifted his head. His eyes were just as empty, his smile just as dreadful. That night, Peppa tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep. She listened to every sound in the house, and then she heard it. First a faint rustle, then a quiet scraping. It was coming from under her bed. Peppa slowly leaned over and peeked beneath. There sat Laboo, her favorite toy. But now, he didn't look the same. His eyes glowed red in the darkness, reflecting the dim light from the window. His smile was stretched far too wide, so distorted it looked as though the fabric of his face had split apart. In his tiny hands, Laboo held a figure. Peppa's heart stopped when she recognized it. It was George, a small, pale copy of her brother with empty eyes and lifeless skin. Laboo raised the figure to his face. His glowing eyes flared brighter, and his smile twisted into something almost inhuman. "He is mine now," he whispered in a low, alien voice. Peppa recoiled, clutching her blanket, squeezing her eyes shut. She prayed it was only a dream. But when she opened them again, Laboo was still there. In his hands, the figure of George remained. Peppa understood. It was him. It was Laboo who had changed George. He had stolen his soul, and now he wouldn't stop. George was only the beginning. The house grew quiet, too quiet. Even her parents in recent days seemed to have forgotten their younger child. When Peppa asked about him, they only gave her long, blank looks and replied, "We've only ever had you." And in that moment, Peppa realized the most terrible truth. Laboo hadn't just taken George. He had begun erasing him. He was sinking deeper and deeper into their house, into their family, into reality itself. And at night, sitting on the shelf in Peppa's room, Laboo smiled faintly. His red eyes glowed dimly in the darkness, and Peppa knew soon he would come for her too. Spring in the pig family's house began with cleaning. Mummy Pig was washing the windows, Daddy Pig was vacuuming, and Peppa and George were dusting their toys. Everything was cheerful, until suddenly, from below, a strange sound echoed from the basement. It was a dull, scraping noise, like something heavy slowly rolling across the floor. "Daddy, did you hear that?" asked Peppa. Daddy Pig didn't respond, too busy tidying up. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by a long rustling. Curiosity took over, and Peppa pulled George by the hand. "Let's go see." Maybe something just fell. They opened the basement door. A wave of damp, dusty air rushed out. The stairs creaked under each step, and the lower they went, the colder it became. In the farthest corner, among old boxes, lay a round object that looked like a tire. It was covered in dust, but beneath the grime, faint wet spots glistened, as if alive. "What's that?" asked George. Peppa stepped closer. Something flickered in the center of the tire. She gasped. It was an eye, large, still, and cloudy, like a frog's. It blinked. The tire shuddered, turned slightly, and Peppa saw that underneath it were human legs, thin and grey, while from the top, emerging out of the shadows, was a frog-like head with a wide mouth and damp, rubbery skin. The creature stood motionless, staring straight at them. George clutched Peppa's hand. "Peppa, what is that?" It didn't move. Only a faint rhythmic whisper came from deep within the basement, as if someone were chanting meaningless words. "Umbalaboo, umbalaboo." Peppa stepped back. "We have to go." But the staircase behind them was gone. In its place hung a thick grey mist. The air grew heavy, almost sticky. A thin vapor rose from the tire, spreading around them. The world began to tremble. The floor disappeared beneath their feet, and the walls melted away, turning into clouds of fog. When the trembling stopped, they were no longer at home. Peppa and George stood in an empty space with no ceiling or floor. Glowing shadows floated slowly in the air, as if the objects themselves had come to life. Toys, shelves, furniture, everything drifted weightlessly, like in a dream. And in the middle of that strange void, it appeared again. Boneka Ambalaboo. Now it was moving, slowly rolling forward like a living tire, leaving behind a wet trail. Its human legs walked on nothing, and its eyeless gaze gleamed faintly through the fog. The creature tilted its head, and from its mouth came a quiet, drawn-out rasping sound. It was like a melody, the warped tune of an old music box, stretched beyond recognition. "I want to go home," whispered George. Peppa looked around. On the ground beside them stood the same music box that started it all. It trembled slightly, as if calling them. "Wind it up," said Peppa. George turned the handle. The melody played again, uneven, distorted. The creature twitched, stretched upward, and its outline began to fade into the mist. The world around them glowed with a pale, ghostly light. For a moment, it felt like they were returning. The air thickened, familiar. Through the mist, the shapes of boxes and shelves emerged once more. But when Peppa opened her eyes, they weren't home. The room looked almost the same, but colder, dimmer. Everything seemed drained of color. "Mummy? Daddy?" called Peppa. No answer, only the echo of her voice, repeating again and again, softer each time. On the floor sat the music box. It was closed. Peppa approached and touched it. From inside came the same whisper. "Amba Laboo." She slowly stepped back, holding George's hand. The whisper repeated. Now it came from behind them. They turned. In the shadow of the stairs stood Boneca Ambalaboo, still, silent. Only its eyes reflected the faint light, as if waiting for the melody to start again. In Peppa's room, there had always been one familiar window looking out onto the garden. But one morning, she noticed something new. On the wall beside her bed, there was now another window. Narrow, with a cracked frame and dim, misted glass. It looked old, as if it had been there for many years, though it had never been there before. Peppa stepped closer. Beyond this window, there was no familiar yard or swings. Instead, a dark forest stretched out, wrapped in grey fog. Tall trees rose upward, their branches intertwining into black patterns. In the distance, among the trunks, stood a figure. It was motionless, yet in its outline, there was something alive. The next day, the figure was closer. Through the mist, Peppa could make out sharp ears, huge round eyes, and a smile too wide to be real. It was Laboo. His silhouette grew darker and clearer, and it seemed that each day he took another step closer to the window. Peppa tried to tell Mummy Pig, "Mummy, there's a new window in my room. There's a forest outside it, and someone is standing there." But as soon as Mummy walked into the room, the second window vanished. The wall was ordinary again. "You must have dreamed it, Peppa," Mummy Pig said, patting her daughter's head before leaving. That night, however, Peppa woke again to see the window had returned. In the fog, Laboo stood much closer. His eyes glowed yellow, and Peppa felt the cold from his gaze spread through the room. She pulled the blanket up to her chin, but still couldn't fall asleep. Each morning, the figure was nearer. On the third day, Laboo stood almost at the forest's edge, his long arms stretching forward as if trying to touch the glass. Peppa called her mother again, but the window disappeared the moment she entered. "Enough of this imagination," Mummy Pig said firmly. "There's nothing wrong in your room?" But Peppa knew it wasn't a dream. On the fourth night, a strange sound woke her. From the window came a faint scratching, like claws dragging across glass. Terrified, Peppa watched as the shadowy figure in the mist lifted its head. Laboo was right there now. His glowing eyes stared directly at the level of her bed. In the morning, marks appeared on the glass of the second window, as though someone had scraped it with sharp nails. And at the bottom corner, words were etched, carved from the inside. "You look through the window, but I am inside." Peppa's heart sank. She ran to fetch her mother and tried to show her the writing, but when they returned, the window had vanished again. That night, Peppa didn't go to sleep. She sat wrapped in her blanket, staring at the wall where the window would appear. When the clock hands passed midnight, it returned. Laboo was now standing directly behind the glass. His smile was wider than ever. He didn't move, but Peppa could clearly hear a whisper in her head. "Open the window. I'm waiting for you." She gripped the windowsill tightly, trying not to move. In the silence, she heard only her own breathing, shallow and uneven. Suddenly, the glass trembled slightly, as if someone was pressing against it from the forest side. Peppa screamed, And in that instant, everything vanished. The room was ordinary once more. Only a small, damp sprig of pine needles lay on the floor. Now every morning, Peppa wondered if the second window would appear again. And every night, it did. Laboo was closer each time, and Peppa knew one day he would no longer remain behind the glass. Peppa opened her eyes in the middle of the night and immediately realized something had changed. Their cozy room looked unfamiliar. The wallpaper was peeling, the ceiling was cracked, and toys were scattered in the dust. George had also woken up and sat on his bed, sobbing softly. "Peppa, this isn't our house," he whispered, clutching his dinosaur. The silence was so thick it rang in their ears. And then it broke. In the living room, the television hummed to life. They both knew no one had turned it on. The screen flickered with static, distorting the darkness of the room. Peppa carefully led her brother by the paw downstairs. The living room looked even worse. The floor was stained with damp spots. The furniture creaked as if it had been standing for hundreds of years. Jagged lines and blurry silhouettes danced across the screen. "Mummy? Daddy?" Peppa called, but only a distorted, heavy voice replied, "You have been happy for too long. Now it's time to pay." George clapped his hands over his ears in horror, while Peppa stepped closer. Two glowing spots appeared on the screen. One cold blue, the other warm orange. From these patches of light, shapes began to take form. Their bodies looked as though they were built from blocks, their faces stretched into unnatural smiles. "It's Los Bros," Peppa whispered. "We've come," they said in unison. Their voices sounded as if they came from both the television and directly inside her head. At that moment, Peppa noticed the mirror on the wall. She looked into it and froze. Staring back at her was herself, but twisted. Her eyes were enormous and black, her mouth stretched into a wide grin, and behind her reflection stood two figures, one blue, one orange. Peppa screamed. George, terrified, ran toward the door and suddenly vanished. His cry echoed through the empty house before silence fell again. "George!" Peppa shouted. She dashed through the rooms, opening every door, but their house was no longer a home. Corridors stretched endlessly, windows looked out into black emptiness. On the floor lay George's dinosaur. The toy was dirty, marked with strange stains, blue and orange prints, as though someone had gripped it with both hands. Peppa's heart pounded. She picked up the toy and heard laughter. It came from everywhere at once, from the walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath her. The laughter was childlike and cheerful, yet there was something tortured within it. The television flared again, and now the figures of Los Bros appeared clearly. On the left stood Tralalerit, his aura glowing blue, eyes burning with a cold gleam. His grin was so wide it seemed it might tear his face apart. On the right stood Tung 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 Sito, bathed in orange light. His movements were sharp, his stare piercing, as if he could see straight through her soul. "Where's George?" Peppa cried, though her voice trembled. "He's with us," one answered. "Now it's your turn," added the other. A stream of black smoke burst from the television. It whirled into a vortex, and the entire house began to change. The floor cracked, the walls bent and warped, the ceiling sank lower. Peppa tried to run, but her legs felt as heavy as stone. The shadows on the walls came alive, stretching into hands that clawed at her dress. She tore herself free, but standing before her now were Los Bros themselves. No longer on the screen, but in the room. Their blocky bodies seemed alive, yet their eyes were alien. Blue and orange light intertwined, wrapping around everything. Peppa felt her breathing grow heavier, her heart tighten in her chest. "We will play," they said in unison. "Forever." They stepped closer. The floor beneath her feet vanished, and Peppa fell into a crimson void. The last thing she saw were their faces grinning in the darkness and their hands reaching out to her. And then the house sank into silence. Only in the forest, near their home, one can sometimes hear children's laughter and a faint whisper carrying two voices, one blue, one orange.